Today, we're talking about labels. Come here. Well, come here. I need to put this on you. That didn't work. And one of the most important labels that you can wear as someone who is engaged in the act of writing. I'm going to take this off now. Do you consider yourself to be a writer or an author? I did a channel poll on this last week, and it seems like the majority of people consider themselves to be writers. Well, the people who aren't cats, I guess. Anyway, I want to discuss what I think is the real difference between these two terms. You might think that it's a bit pedantic to discuss the nuances in meaning between two very similar words, but this is a writing channel, so basically all we do is discuss the nuances between using different words. So there's a lot of different angles that you can look at the labels of writer and author through, and I do think the difference really matters. In my view, at least, author is a term rooted in output. You authored a short story, you authored a novel. Writer is a term rooted in process. A writer is someone who writes. Being an author is based on what you have written. Being a writer is based on the fact that you write and continue to write. Both are terms focused on the work of writing, but in the case of a writer, work is a verb, and in the case of an author, work is a noun. You can become an author and remain an author for all eternity, assuming that you authored something, but I think you're really only a writer as long as the writing process is active in your life in some way. This distinction is important because I hear from people from time to time who aren't interested in writing as a long-term pursuit. They want to write a novel or a short story or a screenplay or whatever as a sort of bucket list item. These are folks who want to become an author, published or not published. We'll talk about that in a minute. But their main goal is to author something. They want to have written a novel or written a short story or have written a screenplay. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. If that is something that's on your bucket list, something that you want to do someday, I just think it's a different pursuit from someone who wants to be a writer as I've defined it here, and I think the distinction does matter. I would also argue that an author doesn't need to be published either. Again, I think the term author is more rooted in the work that someone has completed rather than the status of that work as far as whether it's published or not. We could maybe use the modifier published author or self-published author or traditionally published author or traditionally self-published author to perhaps describe the term in more detail. That's debatable. I think a lot of people would split the author-writer dichotomy right down the line of publication, and that's totally fine. Now, for someone to become an author, they do need to spend some time, at least some time, as a writer. There's some caveats there. I mean, there's the whole ghost writer thing, which I guess would let somebody become an author without really writing. And then there's the people using AI to write for them. I'm not even going to touch that topic today because it's just a massive distraction and rabbit hole and not really the focus of what I want to talk about in this video. So we're just going to set those two things aside and assume that in order to author something, you have to spend some amount of time as a writer writing that thing for now. If you want to author a novel, regardless of whether you want to publish it or not, you need to spend some time engaged in the act of writing. You need to spend some time as a writer. A writer is, by my definition at least, someone who engages in the practice of writing. People talk sometimes about real writers and what it actually takes to call yourself a writer and on and on. I think the best way to look at the definition of who's a writer and who isn't is based solely on what you're doing. Whether you've been doing that for one day or 5 decades, you're still considered a writer, at least in my book. I don't think writer is something that you could like biopsy and find in a person. It's just an action that a person takes. You're not a writer because you are or aren't a writer. You are a writer because you do some writing. Writing is kind of like being on fire in that it's painful and I really wouldn't recommend it. You either are on fire or you aren't at any given moment. And the fact that you might have once been on fire or are going to be on fire in the future doesn't really affect the state of whether you are on fire or not. Writing is the same way. Whether you are writing currently means that you are a writer. Whether you've written in the past, I don't think gives you this lasting status of being a writer. Writer is a very present-focused state. It's not based on what you've done or what you are planning to do. Writer, in a broad sense, is a term that describes how your time is being spent at the present moment. Now, this time doesn't necessarily need to be spent on writing itself. Any of the ancillary work around writing, like outlining or anything to do with critique, either getting critique or giving critique, revising your work, working with an editor, all of that arguably fits in the same bucket of writing practice. Now, the more time that you spend in the state of being a writer, the more your writing skills will improve. There's caveats to that, but I would argue the biggest contributor to a person's writing skill is the amount of practice that they have. I don't know what else would have a larger impact for most people. Your skill as a writer is the area under the curve of your practice time. That time needs some amount of deliberate intention in order to actually improve. Just writing and making the same mistakes without learning anything new or trying to improve is likely not going to increase your skill as much as it could. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I would say your skill as a writer depends in large part on how much practice you have at writing. Now, some folks out there have authorial ambitions within the context of how we've defined that in this video, usually involving publishing, but those ambitions don't spread to the area of being a writer. There are a lot of people who really like the idea of being an author, but aren't as invested in the idea of being a writer. Largely, I think, because being a writer kind of sucks. You have to invest a lot of time. There's no glory. There's not really a huge sense of accomplishment. There's also no money in just being a writer, although there's often not really much money in being an author either. Writing is a somewhat lonely, sometimes not super fun pursuit, especially if the biggest motivating factor for you to be a writer is just so that you can become an author. This leads people to sometimes minimize the amount of writing practice they do before they tick the box next to their name that says author. Whether this is a bad thing or a good thing really depends on your intentions and what you want out of the process. If you just want to author something, then this is probably good enough. If you want to author something that maximizes on your capability as a writer, minimizing the amount of practice you have before you flip the switch to author is probably not a great idea. I think this ultimately gets to, and the main point that I want to make in this video, several minutes into it, is that what you want to get out of the process, I think, determines what label best fits you. If you are interested in the lifelong pursuit and the improvement and the process itself, then I think you should classify yourself as a writer. A writer, I think when you boil it right down, as I've said several times through this video, is someone who engages in the process of writing in order to improve. Writing for them is a verb. It's something that they do, something that they keep doing to get better at. Author, on the other hand, is more focused on output. It's more focused on completing work. It's more focused on the external things and that sort of accomplishment and the identity around having been someone who authored something. There's nothing wrong with that, and you can absolutely do both things, and I would say the most successful authors out there probably fit both labels. But there are also a group of people who really strongly want to be an author, but don't necessarily want to be a writer. And that, I think, has some dangers inherent with it. But if that's what you want to do, I'm not going to discourage you from it. So here we are. This video kind of wandered a little bit more than I was expecting it to. Anyway, I don't know what we really accomplished here today besides me rambling on for 10 or 12 minutes about something, but I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. I have to go tape something to the cat.